She had bodyguards, cameras on every floor, a security budget bigger than most cities spent on their entire police departments, and none of it mattered. They took her anyway. In 12 minutes flat, they walked through every layer of protection her money could buy and vanished into the dark with Sloane Carrington locked in the back of a black van, hands zip-tied, heart hammering, wondering if her father had been right all along, that the one thing money absolutely could not purchase was the right person standing in the right place at the right moment. That person turned out to be a man she had never bothered to learn the name of. If this story already has you leaning forward, you're exactly who I made this for. Hit subscribe right now so you never miss what's coming next. Every week I bring you stories like this one, human, complicated, and impossible to put down. Smash that like button and drop a comment telling me your city and country. I want to see how far this story travels. Now settle in. This one is going to take a while, and it is absolutely worth it. The headquarters of Carrington Strategic Technologies occupied the top 14 floors of a glass tower in downtown Washington, D.C., and at 11:47 on a Tuesday night, almost everyone inside it had gone home. Almost. Sloane Carrington was still at her desk on the 42nd floor, jacket off, reading glasses pushed up into her hair, working through a contract amendment that her legal team had kicked back twice already. The office around her was dark, except for the cone of light over her desk, and the ambient glow of the city coming through the floor-to-ceiling windows behind her. She had long ago stopped noticing the view. The skyline was just wallpaper now, background noise for the machine that was her life. She was 30 years old. She ran a defense technology company with 11,000 employees, 7 government contracts, an annual revenue that required scientific notation to write out properly. She had been doing this for 2 years since her father's heart attack had left her no other option. And in those 2 years, she had learned one thing above all others. The moment you showed weakness, somebody moved into the space it left behind. So she didn't show weakness. She didn't show much of anything, really. Ms. Carrington, the voice came from her doorway. Marcus, one of the 2 overnight security supervisors, a solid man in his early 50s who had worked the building for 9 years. Your car is ready whenever you are. 10 minutes, she said without looking up. Yes, ma'am. He withdrew. She kept reading. It was actually closer to 25 minutes before she closed her laptop, shrugged her jacket back on, and gathered her bag. By then it was nearly 12:30. The elevator down to the parking garage took 45 seconds. Her car, a black armored Escalade, one of 2 the company kept for executive transport, was idling near the elevator bank exactly where it was supposed to be. Her driver, a man named Terry, who had been with the company longer than she had, nodded when she climbed in. Long one tonight. They're all long ones, she said. Terry pulled out of the garage, turned onto the service road that ran along the building's north side, and headed for the street. That was as far as they got. The first vehicle came from the left, a heavy panel van that blew a red light and hit the passenger side of the Escalade hard enough to shunt it sideways across 2 lanes. Sloane's head snapped against the window. She heard Terry shout something, heard the shriek of metal, felt the whole chassis shudder as the Escalade's armored frame absorbed the hit, but couldn't fully resist the momentum. Then the second vehicle appeared in the windshield. Another van, this one parked sideways across the road ahead of them, headlights off, just sitting there like a wall. Terry hit the brakes. Too late. 3 men in dark clothing and close-fitting masks came out of the panel van before the vehicles had fully stopped moving. They moved like people who had done this before, fast, deliberate, no wasted motion. One went to the driver's door. One went to Terry's window with something Sloane couldn't quite see, but Terry clearly could, because he stopped fighting immediately and put both hands on the dashboard. The third man opened Sloane's door. "Get out," he said. His voice was flat, professional. Not angry, which somehow made it worse. Sloane's mind ran 3 calculations simultaneously. The distance to the nearest other person, the likelihood that screaming would help, and what her father's voice would sound like if he were sitting next to her telling her what to do. She came up empty on all 3. She got out. They zip-tied her wrists in front of her, put a cloth hood over her head, and had her in the back of the second van within 90 seconds of initial impact. She could hear doors slamming, engines, and then movement. The particular lurch of a vehicle accelerating, changing direction, accelerating again. She tried to count turns. Lost count at 4. Nobody spoke to her. That was the part that frightened her most. If this was a ransom situation, you talked to the product. The fact that nobody said a word meant either they were very professional and very disciplined, or she wasn't being kept for ransom at all. She focused on her breathing the way she'd once read you were supposed to. In through the nose, out through the mouth. Don't give them the panic. Don't let them see that your hands are shaking inside the zip ties, and your stomach has turned completely over. The drive lasted, she guessed, somewhere between 40 minutes and an hour. It was impossible to be sure. When the van finally stopped and they pulled her out, she could smell something industrial. Oil and cold concrete and the particular damp that comes from buildings left empty too long. They walked her through a door, down what felt like a long corridor, and into a room where they sat her in a chair and secured her wrists to something behind it. Someone removed the hood. The room was large. Used to be some kind of manufacturing space, maybe. High ceilings, exposed steel beams, banks of windows near the roofline that let in thin stripes of ambient city light. The floor was bare concrete. There were crates against one wall and coils of cable near another, the residue of whatever operation used to run here. Fluorescent work lights had been set up in two corners, cold and functional. 4 men. All masked. One seemed to be in charge. He stood slightly apart from the others and was the only one who had spoken. "What do you want?" Sloane said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. A small victory. The one in charge looked at her for a moment. "We want you to be patient." "That's not an answer." "It's the only one you're getting right now." He walked away. The other 3 arranged themselves around the room in positions that were clearly habitual, covering the door, the windows, the space between her and the exit. These were not opportunists or amateurs. Whoever had sent them had spent money doing it, and whoever had spent that money knew what they were paying for. Sloane looked at the windows near the ceiling, 12, 15 feet up, no help there. She looked at the door. 1 man between her and it, and her hands were tied. She looked at the crates along the wall. Nothing useful visible. She settled back in the chair and made herself think clearly, because the alternative was to let the fear take over completely, and that was something she could not afford. Someone had gotten past her security detail. Someone had known her route, her timing, which car she'd be in. That meant someone had either been watching for a very long time, or someone inside her organization had told them what to watch for. Both possibilities were bad. The second one was worse. She had been sitting there for somewhere between 2 and 3 hours. Time had become approximate, and she'd stopped fighting that, when she heard something. It came from above. The ceiling was intact, but the building had a second level, a kind of mezzanine that ran along the back wall and connected to what looked like an old foreman's office. The sound was faint, a footstep maybe, or the building settling. The man nearest the door heard it too. He turned his head slightly. The one in charge moved his hand toward his jacket. Then nothing. A full minute of nothing. One of the 4 relaxed first, which was probably the mistake. He shifted his weight, let his attention drift back to Sloane, and that was when the door of the foreman's office opened quietly and a figure came through it and down the metal stairs along the back wall with a speed and economy of motion that was almost strange to watch. Not dramatic, not aggressive looking, just very fast and very certain, like a man who had already worked out every step before he took it. What happened next was not like the movies. It was uglier than that, and also faster. The man nearest the stairs turned and raised his hands and got hit twice before he could do anything useful with them. The second man came across the room, and the figure, Sloane still couldn't see his face clearly in the bad light, sidestepped and redirected. And the second man went into a stack of crates hard enough to knock 2 of them over. The third man pulled something from his jacket. There was a sharp crack. Not a gunshot, something else, a sound she couldn't identify. And the third man sat down abruptly on the concrete and didn't get back up. The one in charge had moved behind Sloane during all of this, which she realized about a half-second too late. She felt his hands grab her chair, felt him start to drag her backward toward a side door she hadn't noticed before. She threw her weight forward, and the chair tipped, and she went with it. Hit the concrete on her shoulder hard enough to send white sparks across her vision, and the man in charge stumbled over her. That was apparently enough. The figure was across the room in the time it took her to register the pain in her shoulder. 3 seconds of something she refused to watch closely, and then the man in charge was on the floor and the room was quiet except for Sloane's own breathing, which had abandoned any pretense of control. She was lying on her side on the concrete. Her shoulders screamed. Her wrists were still zip-tied and connected to the tipped-over chair, which was now pinning part of her jacket. Footsteps approached. Someone crouched down in front of her. "Miss Carrington." The voice was quiet, unhurried. "Are you hurt?" She looked up. The face looking back at her belonged to a man she recognized from passing in hallways, from the elevator lobby, from the corner of her eye at company events she attended, and he worked security at. I was somewhere in his mid-30s, lean and weathered in a way that made him look slightly older, with dark eyes that were watching her with a focused calm she found deeply unsettling under the circumstances. Cole Vance. She knew his name only because HR had flagged his employment file 18 months ago, when she'd conducted a review of all long-term staff inherited from her father's tenure. He'd been with the company 6 years. Security team. Night shifts, mostly. Kept to himself. His file noted in the spare language HR used for such things that he was a single parent. She had read his file for approximately 90 seconds and moved on. "I know you," she said, which was a stupid thing to say, but was what came out. "Yes, ma'am." He pulled a small tool from his jacket, a folding knife, blade barely 2 inches, and cut the zip tie in one practiced motion. Then he helped her sit upright. His grip was firm without being rough. Careful, almost. Like someone used to helping people who had just been through something bad and needed to be handled without adding to it. "Are you hurt?" he asked again. "My shoulder." She rotated it experimentally. Hurt badly, but moved okay. "Hey, I don't think anything's broken." "Can you stand?" "Yes." He helped her up anyway. She didn't argue. She looked around the room. 3 men on the floor, none of them moving. The fourth, the leader, was propped against the wall in a seated position, conscious but clearly not planning to go anywhere, his hands zip-tied in front of him with restraints Cole had apparently brought with him for the purpose. "How did you—" She stopped, started again. "How did you find me?" I'll explain later," he said. "Right now we need to get you out of here. Law enforcement is on their way, but I'd rather have you outside and secured before they arrive." His voice had the same quality she'd noticed in the way he moved. No wasted energy in it. He wasn't performing calm. He just was calm, the way a person is calm when they've been in enough genuinely bad situations that this particular one has been filed somewhere in the manageable category. Sloane looked at him for a moment longer than was probably appropriate given the circumstances. "You work in my building," she said. "You work night security in my building." "Yes, ma'am." "You're a security guard." Something moved in his expression, not quite a smile. "Tonight I'm more of a contractor," he said. "Let's go." They went. Outside, the industrial facility turned out to be a closed manufacturing plant in a light industrial district in Northern Virginia. She could orient herself once she was out of the building, could see the approximate part of the sky she expected. Cole had a vehicle parked 2 blocks away. Not something the company had sent. His own car, a 7-year-old gray pickup with a booster seat in the back that was slightly too small for a kid who'd outgrown it, but hadn't been replaced yet. She noticed the booster seat. She didn't say anything about it. They sat in his truck while sirens grew closer, and for the first time in several hours, Sloane felt her hands stop shaking. Not entirely, but enough. The feeling was so unfamiliar that for a moment she didn't recognize what it was. It was safety. The particular quality of being safe when you expected not to be. She looked at Cole Vance, who was watching the building's entrance in his rear-view mirror, waiting for law enforcement. With the same unhurried patience he seemed to bring to everything, his hands loose on the steering wheel of a pickup that was older than his employment contract with her company. She did not know this man. She had worked in the same building as him for 2 years, and she did not know this man at all. And he had just walked into an armed facility alone and gotten her out of it. The first police vehicle turned onto the block, lights going. Cole put the truck in park and reached for the door handle. "Stay in the vehicle," he said. "I'll talk to them first, then bring them to you." "Mr. Vance?" He paused with his hand on the handle. "Why?" she said. It was a small word for a large question. He looked at her. In the wash of the approaching lights, she could see his face clearly for the first time, the tiredness in it, and underneath the tiredness something older and quieter, something that had been carrying weight for a long time and had simply gotten used to the weight. "Because nobody should have gotten to you tonight," he said. "And they did. So." He got out of the truck. Sloane sat in the passenger seat of his 7-year-old pickup with the outgrown booster seat in the back. and she watched a man she had never bothered to look at cross a parking lot in the middle of the night to explain to law enforcement how he had just done something that her entire security infrastructure had failed to do. She had a lot of money. She had always believed that money, properly deployed, could solve most problems. Sitting in Cole Vance's truck at 12 minutes past 2 in the morning, Sloane Carrington began to suspect she had been wrong about that, and about several other things besides. The debrief with federal agents lasted 4 hours. Sloane sat in a conference room at the FBI's field office in Northern Virginia with a paper cup of bad coffee going cold in front of her, answering questions from 2 agents who were thorough and professional and clearly exhausted, the same way she was exhausted, except they hadn't spent 3 hours zip-tied to a chair in an abandoned manufacturing plant. She answered everything they asked. She described the vehicles, the men, the facility, the timeline as best she could reconstruct it. She was precise and organized and gave them nothing they'd have to come back and clarify later, because that was simply how she operated, even when her shoulder was bruised purple and her hands still had the faint red marks from the zip ties, and she'd been awake for nearly 22 hours. Cole sat in a different room. She knew that because she'd seen the second agent lead him off when they arrived. The 2 of them separated immediately, in the way law enforcement separated people whose accounts they needed to take independently. It was standard procedure. She understood that. What she hadn't expected was how much she noticed his absence, considering she'd spent the previous 6 years not noticing his presence at all. At 6 in the morning, a Carrington Company attorney arrived and the questioning shifted into a different register. By 7:30, she was in a company car heading back to D.C., a different Escalade with a 4-person detail she didn't remember requesting. Her head of corporate security, a man named Brandt, who was former Secret Service and had never once failed to project total confidence, sat across from her in the back seat and said almost nothing for the first 20 minutes of the drive. She could tell he was working out how to have a conversation he didn't want to have. "Say it," she finally said. "We had a protocol failure," Brandt said. "Multiple points. I've already initiated an internal review." "Who knew my route last night?" "Dispatch." "Your driver." "The 2 supervisors on overnight." "And which of them talked to someone they shouldn't have?" Brandt looked at her steadily. "That's what the review is going to determine." "Fast track it," she said. "I want preliminary findings by end of week." "Yes, ma'am." She looked out the window. The city was just starting to move. Early commuters, delivery trucks, the particular gray and yellow light of a DC morning that never quite decided whether it wanted to be pretty. "Cole Vance," she said. A brief pause. "Night security, yes?" "How long has he been with us?" 6 years, maybe 6.5. He was already on the roster when I came on." "Did you know about his background?" Another pause, longer this time. She turned from the window and looked at Brandt directly. He met her gaze without flinching, which she respected, but she could see something in his expression that was not quite embarrassment and not quite defensiveness, but was somewhere in the uncomfortable territory between the 2. "Not the full picture," he said. "What part of the picture did you have?" "I knew he'd done military service, the file notes that." "His file notes prior military service," she said. "Yes, I read his file. I read everyone's file when I did the personnel review in year 1. His took me less than 2 minutes. She paused. "I should have read it more carefully." Brandt didn't respond to that, which was the right call. She didn't go home. She went to the office, which her assistant Patricia tried to prevent by meeting her at the elevator with a look that mixed genuine concern with practiced efficiency. "You should not be here," Patricia said. "You've been awake since... What's on the morning schedule?" Patricia exhaled slowly through her nose. She had worked for Sloane for 3 years and had developed a very specific exhale for situations like this. "Board chair wants a call. Legal is waiting on the contract amendment. You have a 10 o'clock with the defense procurement. Push everything until afternoon. Get me the full HR file on Cole Vance, every document in it, on my desk in an hour. And I need the contact information for whoever handles our background verification contracts." Patricia wrote all of this down without expression. "And the board chair?" "I'll call him from my office. Give me 20 minutes first." She was at her desk within 5 minutes, jacket still on, and for the first time in a long time, she sat there without opening her laptop or reaching for her phone. She just sat. Her shoulder ached. The coffee Patricia brought her was good coffee, real coffee, and she held the cup with both hands and let herself be still for approximately 90 seconds, which was about as long as she was capable of. Then she opened her laptop and started pulling threads. Cole Vance's HR file arrived in 40 minutes. Patricia was efficient when pushed. Sloane read it properly this time. All of it. Employment history, performance reviews, benefits enrollment, emergency contact information. The emergency contact was listed as Lila Vance, daughter, age 8. Below that, a note in the original onboarding paperwork. No other family contacts available. No other family contacts available. She sat with that for a moment. The performance reviews were consistent. Every supervisor who'd written one used variations of the same language. Reliable, professional, low maintenance, good instincts. Nobody had ever promoted him or nominated him for anything. He'd never asked for anything, apparently. He showed up, did his work, went home to whatever his life was outside the building. At the bottom of the file, in a section that was used for special notations, someone had written 3 words in the spare shorthand of administrative record keeping. Retained per RCC. RCC. Richard Cole Carrington. Her father. Sloane stared at those 3 letters for a while. Then she picked up the phone and called the background verification firm. What they sent back over the next 48 hours, because she pushed them and pushed them hard, authorizing access to everything their clearances permitted, did not arrive in a tidy package. It came in pieces, each one requiring context she didn't have yet. So she built the context herself, reading military records and public service documentation and cross-referencing dates and locations until she had something that resembled a complete picture. Cole Vance had enlisted at 19. That was the beginning of it. A kid from a working-class family outside of Richmond, Virginia, no particular plan except that he'd always been drawn to the idea of doing something that meant something. He'd tested high enough that he'd gotten a harder look than most recruits. By 24, he was through Bud-S and had his trident. What followed was a career that the military summarized in the flat bureaucratic language reserved for things that cannot be fully described in language. Multiple deployments. Operations in regions that were named obliquely in unclassified records. Decorations that required Sloane to look up what they were awarded for. The Silver Star. The Bronze Star with Valor. A Purple Heart, from an incident in Year 7 that the records described only in terms of medical outcome, not circumstance. He was good at what he did. That much was clear even through the institutional fog of official records. His commanding officer's evaluations, the portions that weren't redacted, described him consistently, cool under pressure, team first, the kind of operator who made the people around him better. And then it stopped. 14 years into his service, the record simply ended. An honorable discharge. A date. And underneath that, a medical separation notation with a code she had to have explained to her by the background verification firm. It indicated psychological injury alongside physical, the kind of combination that the military handled with varying degrees of competence depending on the unit and the era. He would have been 31 when he left. Lila was 8 now. The math suggested his daughter had been born very close to the time everything ended, and his wife, there was a marriage record, a Sarah Ellen Vance née Goodman, had died 18 months after Lila was born. A car accident. The kind of thing that happened to ordinary people in ordinary circumstances and destroyed everything anyway. Sloane put the file down and looked out her office window at the skyline she'd stopped seeing years ago. She tried to construct what the sequence of that felt like from the inside. The career ending badly, the new baby, the wife dying before the baby was old enough to remember her. The man left standing in the middle of all of that with a child and no other family contacts available, and whatever he'd carried out of his last deployment still sitting somewhere in his chest. Then she remembered the 3 letters at the bottom of his HR file. Retained per RCC. Her father had known. Her father had known who Cole was and had made sure he had a job and never once told her why. She needed to understand why. Sloane was not someone who believed in coincidences. She believed in information she didn't have yet. She went looking for it the same way she always went looking for things she didn't have. Methodically, without sentiment, following the connective tissue between one fact and the next. She pulled her own childhood records. Not the official ones, her family's private archive, the documents her father had kept in the estate's home office that she'd never gotten around to fully cataloging after his death. She'd meant to. She'd been busy. It took her 2 evenings and a conversation with her father's former personal assistant, A woman named Grace, who was 71 years old and had worked for Richard Carrington for 30 years and had been devastated by his death in a way that was still quietly visible 2 years later. The dog incident, Grace said, when Sloane described what she was looking for. They were on the phone. It was nearly 9 at night. Oh, I remember that. Tell me what you know. You were 7, the summer before second grade. You'd gotten away from Mrs. Hensley. She was the afternoon caretaker that year, before the Prestons. And you'd wandered 2 blocks from the house. There was a German shepherd that had gotten loose from a yard. It cornered you between 2 parked cars. A pause. Your father never talked about it in detail because it frightened him too much even after the fact. But a boy from the neighborhood stepped between you and the dog, took the worst of it so you could run. How old was he? 16, maybe 17, a teenager. Another pause. Your father paid his medical bills, wanted to do more. That was your father, always wanting to do more. But the family was private about it. Didn't want charity, he said. But your father kept track of the boy. He always kept track. Sloane stood in the kitchen of her penthouse with the phone pressed against her ear and the city visible through every window around her, and she was very quiet for a long moment. Cole Vance, she said. I never knew his name, Grace said. Your father never said. But it sounds right, doesn't it? That he would have found a way to look after him. It sounded exactly right. It sounded like everything she knew about her father, the man who never forgot a debt, who believed that specific human kindness deserved specific human acknowledgement, who would have found the quiet and private way to make sure a teenage boy who'd thrown himself in front of a dog grew up with at least one door open to him. And Cole had never told anyone, had never used it, had never walked into her office and said, by the way, I once took 40 stitches so your father's daughter could run away safely. Does that count for anything? He just worked his shifts. She thought about the inside of his truck, the outgrown booster seat, the paper cup from a gas station coffee that had been sitting in the cup holder. She thought about how he'd crouched down in front of her in that building, unhurried, careful, like someone long practiced in the specific task of helping frightened people without adding to their fright. She needed to talk to him. She'd been told by the company's legal team that she should run all communication with Cole Vance through HR until the federal investigation completed its preliminary phase as a liability precaution. It was sensible advice. She'd given HR sensible advice herself for 2 years and knew exactly how sensible it was. She called him directly. He answered on the 3rd ring. His voice was the same as she remembered from the truck, unhurried, no performance in it. Ms. Carrington, I have questions, she said. I'd like to ask them in person. Are you available tomorrow morning? A brief silence. I work 7 to 3. Before your shift then, 8 o'clock. There's a coffee place on Meridian, 3 blocks from headquarters. I'd rather not do this in the building. Another silence. Longer. She couldn't tell what was in it. All right, he said. Thank you. Thank you. I'll see you tomorrow. She hung up and stood in her kitchen for another minute. Then she went to bed, which was something she almost never did before 11. And she lay in the dark and looked at the ceiling and thought about a teenage boy she didn't remember, couldn't remember. She'd been 7 and terrified, who'd stepped between her and something that wanted to hurt her. 23 years later, he'd done it again. The coffee place on Meridian was small and slightly cramped, the kind of neighborhood spot that had survived because its regulars were loyal and its coffee was genuinely good. Sloane got there first and took a table in the back corner. She ordered black coffee and waited. Cole came in at 2 minutes past 8. He was in civilian clothes, dark jeans, a plain gray jacket, work boots that had seen a few years. He looked different out of the security uniform and not in the way she'd expected. Not smaller. Just less defined by the context. She realized she'd only ever seen him in the building, which gave him a background, a role, a category. Without those, he was just a man who moved through a coffee shop with the same quiet economy he brought to everything else. He ordered at the counter without looking at the menu and came to the table and sat down across from her. He didn't say good morning. He just settled in and looked at her with those dark, watchful eyes and waited. I'm going to ask you some things, she said. I'd appreciate straight answers. I'll give you what I can. That night, how did you know where I was? Something shifted in his expression. Not reluctance exactly. More like the look of someone deciding how much of a story to tell and where to begin it. He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. Your security team uses a routing protocol that dispatches change at 11 p.m., he said. Whoever planned this knew that. They knew your vehicle, your route, your timing. That's inside information. He paused. I noticed something off in the lobby camera feeds around 11:30. One of the exterior feeds had been looped. It was cycling a clean 4-minute segment instead of live footage. Whoever did it was good, but not good enough. And you traced that to? Not to anything specific, but it told me someone was setting something up, and you were the only executive in the building. He took a drink of his coffee. I tried to reach your driver first. No answer. Tried building dispatch. By then the feed on the parking garage exit had gone dark, which meant your car had already left and the garage camera had been killed. He set the cup down. So I followed. Alone. It was faster. She looked at him. You followed, alone, a professional extraction team that had just taken the CEO of a major defense corporation. I had a location approximation from your cell tower, and I had some experience with that kind of situation. His voice was even. It wasn't nothing. It wasn't nothing, she repeated slowly. You had cell tower data and some experience. And a vehicle. She almost laughed. It surprised her. She hadn't been close to laughing in days. She pressed her mouth flat and steadied herself. Mr. Vance, I've spent the last 2 days reading your service record. He went very still. Not tense, still, the way things go, still right before they change. You were a SEAL for 14 years, she said. Your decorations… She stopped herself. She had planned this conversation to be direct, and she would be. You were one of the best-regarded operators in your unit, multiple combat decorations. And then you were separated with a medical and psychological notation, and you came here and spent 6 years working night security shifts and never told anyone. No one asked, he said quietly. Why didn't you… She caught herself again, reframed. The foundation my father built around keeping you employed. Did you know about that? He looked at the table for a moment. First time he'd broken eye contact. I knew he'd done something to help me get the job. I didn't ask how much. Did you know why? He looked back up. His expression had changed slightly, something more careful in it now. He told me. When he hired me. He came down to the building himself, first week. I didn't know who he was at first. A pause. He said he'd been looking for me for a while. Said he owed me a door. I told him he didn't owe me anything. He said that was exactly why he was doing it. Sloane felt something in her throat tighten in a way she didn't immediately know what to do with. Her father had been dead for 2 years. She thought she'd finished being surprised by him. Apparently not. You saved my life when I was 7, she said, and again 3 nights ago. Cole said nothing. And you've been working in my building for 6 years. That's right. Did you know who I was? The first day you started, did you know I was Richard Carrington's daughter? Yes? She studied his face. And you never said anything to me. It wasn't my place. Mr. Vance, she leaned forward slightly. You took 40 stitches because of me. I don't actually remember it. I was 7. I was terrified. The whole thing is a blur in my memory. But you were a teenager. That's… She paused, choosing the word deliberately. That's not nothing either. He turned his coffee cup in his hands, a small, restless motion, the only one she'd ever seen from him. I was 16, he said. Teenagers do dumb things for dumb reasons. I did something dumb that happened to turn out okay. It wasn't heroism, Ms. Carrington. It was just… He stopped. Instinct? She offered. Habit, he said, which surprised her. Even at 16, I couldn't watch someone get hurt when I could do something about it. It was already a habit by then. Where does a 16-year-old develop that habit? He said nothing for a moment. Outside, a bus stopped at the corner and let someone off. The coffee shop filled briefly with noise from the street and then quieted again. Neighborhood, he said finally. Circumstances. Same place most people get most of their habits. She understood that he wasn't going to give her more than that. Not yet. Maybe not ever. She didn't know him well enough to know where his edges were. She knew how to read a balance sheet, a legal contract, a personnel review. She was less practiced at reading people who had deliberately made themselves unreadable. She tried a different angle. The investigation is going to want to understand the security breach, she said. That means looking at everyone who had access to my routing protocols. The federal team has asked us to cooperate fully with their vetting process. She paused. That's going to include you. I know, he said. I expected it. I wanted you to hear it from me directly. And I wanted you to know. She stopped herself, started again. I wanted you to know that I don't believe for a moment that you were any part of what happened. I think you're the only person in the building that night who was definitively not part of it. He nodded once. No relief in it exactly. Just acknowledgement, like a man who'd learned not to expect much and received confirmation rather than surprise. Is there anything you need? She said. For Lila, for anything at home, if the investigation affects your work schedule. We're fine, he said. Slight edge in the word fine, not irritated exactly, more like it was a word he used automatically when people asked and meant to close the question down. She heard it. Okay, she said, and didn't push. They sat for another moment. She finished her coffee. He finished his. The morning moved around them, people coming in for takeout orders, someone's laptop open at the counter, a barista calling names in the patient monotone of someone deep into a long shift. Can I ask you something? Cole said. It was the first time he'd initiated anything in the conversation. She looked at him. Yes. Your father. Was he... He paused, and for the first time she could see something in his face that was not professional calm, but something more personal and uncertain. Was he a good man? I mean, I knew him a little. The version of him that came to see me. I thought he was. But I only saw a small piece. The question landed unexpectedly. She hadn't thought about her father in terms of good or not good. He was her father, which meant he was enormous and complicated and present in everything she did, even 2 years dead. She thought about Grace's voice on the phone, always wanting to do more. She thought about the 3 words in Cole's file. He was complicated, she said. He made decisions that hurt people sometimes. He was hard to know. He worked too much. She paused. But he paid attention to people that most people in his position never would have noticed. He kept track. He thought that specific decency was worth more than general charity. She looked at Cole. He saw something in you that he thought deserved a door. He wasn't wrong. Cole looked at the table again, that small motion with the coffee cup. He shouldn't have gone to the trouble. He thought he should, and he did. And now you've saved his daughter twice. She stood, reaching for her bag. Make of that what you will, Mr. Vance. She left a 20 on the table and put on her coat. She was almost to the door when he spoke again. Ms. Carrington. She turned. I was still sitting, both hands on the table now, looking at her with that direct, unhurried gaze. Whoever got your routing information, he said. They had it fast, clean. That's not someone who spent weeks building access. That's someone who already had it. Someone with regular authorized access to dispatch records. She held his gaze. That narrows it. It does, he said. I've been thinking about the camera loop too. Setting that up from the outside requires either physical access or a remote exploit of the security system. But you'd need the system architecture to do a remote exploit that clean. That's not public information. No, she said. It's not. So whoever this is, Cole said, they either have someone on the inside or they had someone on the inside who gave them enough to work with before they left. He paused. I'd look at people who left in the last year, voluntarily or otherwise. She stared at him. He said it the way he said everything, without drama, like it was simply the logical next step from the preceding fact. You figured that out when? She said. Sitting in the FBI field office waiting to give my statement. He almost shrugged. Had 4 hours and nothing else to do. Sloane stood at the door of the coffee shop on Meridian Street and looked at the man her father had quietly looked after for 6 years. This careful, self-contained, unexpectedly sharp man with an outgrown booster seat in his truck and no family contacts listed in his file, and felt something she wasn't used to feeling. She felt like she'd been careless, not in the security sense, though she'd been that too, but in the particular carelessness of someone who'd spent 2 years in a building full of people and treated most of them as functions rather than facts. Cole Vance had been a function in her mind. Night security, inherited staff, retained per her father's quiet instruction, and she'd never asked why, and she'd never asked who. I'll be looking at it, she said. Thank you for the analysis. Good luck with it, he said. She walked back out into the morning. The city was fully awake now, loud and purposeful, and indifferent in the way cities are indifferent. Not cruel, just enormously busy with its own momentum. She walked the 3 blocks back to headquarters and went up to her office and stood at the window she'd stopped looking out of. And for the first time in 2 years, she looked at the city without calculating what it meant for the company. She thought about a teenage boy taking 40 stitches and never asking for anything in return. She thought about a man building a life around a child in a house she'd never seen, showing up to a job that couldn't have been remotely close to his previous one, year after year, without complaint, without anyone in a position of authority noticing enough to even ask. She thought about the way he'd said, "We're fine," with that small flinch around the word, and how she recognized it from the outside now, even if she'd never been able to see it from the inside. The reflex of someone who'd been asking nothing from anyone for so long that being offered something felt like a transaction they didn't know how to enter. Her father had known how to reach him. Her father had been patient and indirect and had simply held a door open without making it into a debt. She was going to have to learn how to do that. She wasn't sure she knew how yet, but she was going to have to learn because whoever had taken her 3 nights ago had gotten very close, and the only person who'd known where to look for her had been a man working night security in a building full of people who'd never looked at him twice. She wasn't going to make that mistake again. The lead she'd pulled from Cole's observation about the camera loop sat on her desk for 3 days before it cracked open into something useful. It wasn't Brandt's internal review that found it, though the review was thorough. She'd give him that. It was a junior analyst in the IT security division named Priya, 26 years old and 2 years out of Carnegie Mellon, who had the particular gift of being unable to let an inconsistency alone once she'd spotted it. Priya had been cross-referencing system access logs against terminated employee records when she found a ghost credential, a login that technically belonged to a former network administrator who'd left the company 8 months ago but whose remote access certificate had never been fully revoked. Someone had been using it, infrequently, carefully, but using it. Sloane read Priya's report at 7 in the morning, standing at her kitchen counter in the penthouse with the coffee maker running, still in the clothes she'd slept in, which was to say she'd fallen asleep on the couch around 2 a.m. reading case files and had slept approximately 4 hours. She read it twice, then called Brandt. "I'm looking at Priya's findings," she said when he picked up. "This ghost credential, how far back does the access log go?" 7 months, Brandt said. He sounded like he'd been awake for a while already. "Someone went in 9 times total, always between 2 and 4 a.m., always targeting the same cluster of files. Executive routing protocols and the security camera architecture. 9 times over 7 months, she said. That's not opportunistic. No, that's someone with a plan and the patience to execute it slowly. Who managed the revocation process when the administrator left?" A pause. "That would have been routed through the IT infrastructure team." "Which reports to whom?" Another pause, longer. "Deputy CTO, currently Garrett Foles." Sloane set her coffee cup down. Garrett Foles had been with Carrington Strategic Technologies for 11 years. He'd been hired by her father, promoted twice, and had shaken her hand at the funeral with genuine-seeming grief in his eyes. He was 53 years old. He had a wife, 2 kids in college, and a performance review file that was impeccably clean. "I don't want him to know we're looking," she said. "Understood. Pull everything quietly. Don't touch the ghost credential. Leave it active so we can monitor it. And get the federal team involved. This is beyond internal review now." "Already contacted them last night," Brandt said, when Priya first flagged it. She almost said something about the fact that he hadn't called her immediately. She stopped herself. He'd been doing his job. The sequence had been correct. She was running on 4 hours of sleep and a hair trigger, and she needed to be careful about letting that translate into things she'd have to apologize for later. "Good," she said instead. "Keep me in the loop personally, not through the general briefing chain. Me, directly." "Yes, ma'am." She hung up and stood in the kitchen for a moment. Then she thought about Cole's voice in the coffee shop. I'd look at people who left in the last year and thought about how cleanly and quickly he'd arrived at the same general territory that had taken her entire security apparatus 3 days to reach. She picked up her phone again and scrolled to his number. Then she put the phone back down. It was 6:53 in the morning. He was probably getting Lila ready for school. She didn't know why that specific image made her pause. She barely knew what Lila looked like. She'd seen her twice, maybe 3 times, when Cole had brought her to the building lobby for brief handoffs on days that his childcare arrangements had apparently gotten complicated. A small girl with dark hair and her father's serious eyes, and an expression that suggested she was always thinking about something she hadn't decided to share yet. Sloane made herself another coffee and went to get ready for work, and she told herself that the reason she'd put the phone down was professionalism and appropriate timing, and she mostly believed it. It was the following Saturday when she drove to Cole's house. She hadn't called ahead, which she recognized even as she was doing it was a choice, and not a neutral one. Calling ahead gave him the option to arrange himself, to present the version of his home and his life that he was comfortable with a relative stranger seeing. Showing up was either thoughtless or deliberate, and she'd spent enough years in corporate negotiations to know that the difference between those two things mattered. She told herself she was being direct. She suspected she was being strategic, which was the same impulse wearing different clothes. His address was in the HR file. A residential street in a neighborhood in Arlington that was neither poor nor comfortable, the middle register of an expensive city where the houses were small and close together and the yards were practical rather than decorative. His house was a pale yellow Cape Cod with white trim that was peeling in one corner of the front porch, and a maple tree in the front yard that had dropped enough leaves to bury the small concrete path from the sidewalk to the door. She parked and sat in the car for a moment. It was 11:30 on a Saturday morning, and she could see from where she was a bicycle in the driveway, small, pink, one of the training wheel brackets bent at an angle that suggested it had met the ground at speed, and a pair of child-sized rubber boots on the porch steps, purple with frogs on them. She got out of the car. She rang the bell. She heard movement inside almost immediately, quick and light, small feet, and then a child's voice saying something she couldn't quite make out, and then Cole's voice, lower, saying something that made the quick footsteps slow down. A pause. Then the door opened. Cole was in jeans and an old sweatshirt with the sleeves pushed up, and he had a dish towel over one shoulder and paint on the back of his left hand, blue paint, the cheerful primary blue of a child's art project. He looked at her with an expression that was composed but not without surprise. "Miss Carrington," he said. "I should have called," she said. "I know, I'm sorry." "It's fine." He glanced back into the house briefly. "Lila, I'll be right there." Then back to Sloane. "Come in." She stepped inside. The house hit her immediately, not smell exactly, though there was a smell, something baked and warm from earlier in the morning, and underneath it the faint particular smell of crayons and child that was unlike anything in her own living spaces. What hit her was the texture of it, the visual texture. She'd expected modest, and it was modest. But modest wasn't the right word. The right word was inhabited. Lived in to a degree that her penthouse, for all its square footage and quality furniture, was not. There were Lila's drawings on the refrigerator. She could see into the kitchen from the entry. 8 or 10 of them held up with magnets, houses, and animals, and what appeared to be a dragon holding a flag. There was a backpack by the stairs that had been dropped rather than placed, and a library book on the second step that had probably been there since at least Thursday. The couch in the small living room had a blanket on it that was twisted from being slept under and not refolded. On the coffee table, a half-finished puzzle showing a map of the world, several pieces scattered wider than necessary, and a small plastic horse that had wandered into the European continent. On the wall above the couch were 3 framed photographs. Sloane looked at them while Cole moved toward the kitchen, telling her to come through. One was Lila as an infant, wrinkled and startled-looking, held in a hospital by a woman with dark, exhausted eyes who was smiling in a way that had nothing performative in it. One was Cole in uniform, a group photo, 7 or 8 men, desert background, squinting into sun. And one was Lila, at maybe 4 or 5, sitting on Cole's shoulders, at what looked like a state fair, arms out for balance, mouth wide open laughing at something below the frame. Sloane stood in front of that one for a moment too long. "Tea or coffee?" Cole called from the kitchen. "Coffee, please. Whatever's made is fine." The kitchen was slightly larger than the entry had suggested, an older house that had been opened up at some point, the wall between the kitchen and the dining area taken down to let them communicate. Lila was at the dining table with a large sheet of paper and an array of paint pots, the source of the blue on Cole's hand now clear. She was 7 or 8, Cole's same dark coloring, and she looked up at Sloane with the frank evaluating gaze of a child who had not yet learned that staring was considered impolite. "Hi," Lila said. "Hi," Sloane said. "Who are you?" Lila, Cole said, pouring coffee. It's okay, Sloane said. I'm Sloane. I work with your dad. Lila considered this. He never brings people from work here. Lila. Cole's voice had a mild warning in it. She asked who I am, Lila said reasonably. I'm just answering the other part. Cole set a mug in front of Sloane and gave his daughter a look that communicated something in the compressed private language of parents and children that Sloane didn't have the cipher for. Lila appeared to receive it, shrugged one shoulder, and returned to her painting. Cole sat across from Sloane at the table, not the dining table, a smaller one near the window that had 2 chairs and a stack of Lila's school papers on one end, pushed aside to make room for the mugs. He didn't ask why she was there. He just waited, hands around his coffee, the dish towel still on his shoulder. The investigation has a lead, she said. I can't give you details yet, but I wanted you to know it's moving. He nodded. Good. Your observation about the camera loop helped direct us. I wanted you to know that too. She paused. I don't want to take credit for work that wasn't mine. Something moved in his expression, not quite surprise. Thank you for saying that. It was accurate. You thought of it in 4 hours sitting in a federal building. Our security team took 3 days to reach the same territory. She looked at her coffee. That's something I need to understand better. What you bring to a problem, what you see that other people don't. I'm a security guard, he said. His voice was even, but she heard the small flatness in it. Not bitterness, exactly. Something that had been pressed flat by repetition. You were a Navy SEAL for 14 years with a Silver Star and a Bronze Star with Valor, she said quietly. He looked at her. Not angry, just careful. I read your full record, she said, as much of it as was accessible. Most of it isn't accessible. No, but enough. She held his gaze. You don't have to talk about it. I'm not here to make you talk about it. But I want you to understand that I'm not seeing what I was seeing 3 weeks ago when I looked at your file. I'm seeing something different now. She paused. I'm sorry it took someone taking me at gunpoint to make me look properly. He was quiet for a moment. In the background, Lila's brush made small, wet sounds against the paper, and she hummed something under her breath, a tuneless child's hum that had no relation to any actual song. What do you want to know? Cole said finally. Only what you're willing to tell me. He looked out the window. The maple tree in the front yard was visible from here, nearly bare now, the last few leaves moving in whatever wind was passing through. The last mission, he said, I'm assuming that's in there somewhere. In summary, not in detail. There were 6 hostages, he said. His voice changed slightly, not in pitch, but in texture. The way a voice changes when it's recounting something that has been recounted internally many times but rarely externally. The particular flatness of a story told to yourself so often, it's worn smooth. We had solid intelligence going in, solid enough that the decision was made to move fast rather than wait for a second confirmation. I agreed with that call. I was part of making it. He paused. The intelligence was wrong. Not slightly wrong. Catastrophically wrong. The location we thought was a secondary holding area was actually where they'd moved 4 of the 6 hostages 2 days earlier. We didn't know. Another pause. We got to the primary location. 2 hostages, both alive. The other 4... He stopped. By the time we reached the secondary location, it had already been too late for a while. Sloane didn't say it. There was nothing to say that wouldn't make it smaller than it was. The investigation cleared the team, he said. Cleared me specifically. Bad intelligence, impossible timeline, the report said. No fault. He picked up his coffee and put it back down without drinking. But 4 people went home in boxes and their families got flags, and the investigation said no fault, and He stopped again. I couldn't make those 2 things sit together, the clearance and the 4 boxes. I tried for a while. I couldn't. So you left. Sarah was pregnant with Lila by then. We'd been talking about me getting out anyway. She wanted a different kind of life, and I'd been putting it off for years. The mission made the decision easier. He paused. And then Sarah died, and Lila was 18 months old, and easy and difficult stopped being useful categories. He said it without self-pity, which made it worse somehow. Self-pity would have been a kind of armor. The way he said it was just the plain, unadorned fact, set down on the table between them like something heavy he'd carried so long he'd forgotten other people couldn't see it. I'm sorry, Sloane said, about Sarah. Thank you. And about the mission. He looked at her. That's not something people usually apologize for. I'm not apologizing for the mission. I'm saying I'm sorry it happened. There's a difference. He considered that for a moment. Something shifted in his face, subtle, the kind of shift you'd miss if you weren't watching. Yeah, he said. There is. From the dining table, Lila said without looking up, Dad, I need more blue. Cole got up and went to the art supply drawer near the sink and found a larger pot of blue paint and brought it over. Lila held it up and examined it with the critical eye of someone who knew exactly what shade she was working with and was verifying the replacement was acceptable. This is darker, she said. It's the same, Cole said. It's darker. Then use less water. Lila looked at him with an expression that suggested she found this advice technically correct, but personally unsatisfying. She accepted the paint. Cole came back to the table and sat down and looked at Sloane with an expression that held something new in it. Not quite openness, but the place just before openness, where a person is deciding whether to take the next step or hold where they are. You came here to tell me about the investigation, he said. And something else. She hadn't framed it to herself in those terms, but she recognized the accuracy of it. Yes, she said. What's the something else? She looked at him steadily. I want you working with my security team directly, not as a night shift guard, as a consultant, effectively, on this situation specifically. She paused. I want the person who looked at a camera feed at 11:30 at night and understood what he was seeing in enough time to follow my car and find me in a building he'd never been to. I want that person looking at what's happening from the inside, not from a guard station. Cole said nothing for a moment. I know you don't need the money, she said. It came out more bluntly than she'd intended. That's not what I'm offering. I'm offering... She stopped, reorganized. You said you believed every life you save now is repayment. You said that once, in the truck that night. Well, you didn't say it exactly, but I heard the shape of it. She paused. I'm not asking you to save anyone. I'm asking you to help me figure out who's trying to get someone killed. There's a difference. You've been thinking about this for a while, he said. Since the coffee shop. He looked at his hands on the table. The blue paint was still on the left one, a small patch on the knuckle. I have a daughter, he said. I have to think about what I can and can't do in terms of what happens to her if something goes wrong. I know that. She's the reason I took a night security job instead of something with more exposure, he said. Not because I couldn't do more, because she's lost enough people. I know that too, Sloane said. I'm not asking you to walk back into a combat situation. I'm asking you to sit at a table with smart people and tell them what you see. Your read on the camera loop is evidence of exactly the skill I need. You can go home to Lila every night. He was quiet for long enough that Lila finished her painting and held it up to examine it. A house with a large tree and two figures in the front yard and a dragon in the sky, which she had painted with the careful devotion of something that mattered to her. It's good, Cole said, without being asked. The dragon needs more teeth, Lila said critically, but I ran out of room. You could do a close-up of the dragon on a different page. Lila considered this seriously. That's actually a good idea, she said, and started looking for a new sheet of paper with the focused efficiency of a person who had received workable advice and intended to act on it immediately. Cole looked back at Sloane. Something had settled in his face. Not a decision exactly, but the place just after the decision, where the deciding is done and what remains is the articulation of it. The nights are Lila's, he said. Whatever this is, it doesn't touch her schedule, her school, her bedtime routine, the things she counts on. Agreed. And I'm not doing it as a title or a promotion. I'm not interested in HR classifications and what bracket something puts me in. I'm doing it because it's the right call and because... He stopped. Something crossed his face that was not quite comfort with what he was about to say. Because I don't want someone to have another chance at you. That's the honest version. Sloane held his gaze. There was something in the plainness of it. The I don't want someone to have another chance at you, stated without drama or performance, stated the way he stated everything, a simple fact, that moved through her defenses in a way she hadn't anticipated and didn't quite have a category for. That's the version I prefer, she said. The honest one. He nodded. Then, yes. They talked for another hour. Not about the investigation this time, or not directly. He walked her through how he'd read the building's security architecture over 6 years of working in it, the patterns he'd noticed and never said anything about because nobody had asked, and it hadn't been his place, the gaps in coverage that he'd made notes on and then done nothing with because he was a night security guard, and notes from night security guards went into a drawer and stayed there. She listened to all of it with the same focused attention she brought to financial briefings and legal strategy sessions. And she asked the right questions, and she watched him talk, watched the slight shift in his posture when he was working through something complicated, the way he would pause and look at the middle distance before delivering a conclusion, the absence of any need for her to be impressed. And she understood something she hadn't understood before. Her father hadn't looked after Cole Vance because he felt indebted. He'd looked after him because he'd recognized something in the boy who threw himself in front of a dog, some quality that he'd seen was rare and worth protecting, the capacity for unconditional action, the willingness to put yourself between danger and someone who couldn't protect themselves, not for reward, not for recognition, not even for reasons you'd consciously articulated, but simply because it was the next right thing and standing still was not in you. Her father had been a businessman who believed that kind of person was valuable in proportion to how much the world undervalued them. He had not been wrong. At 1:15, Cole said he needed to get Lila lunch, and Sloane said she'd let them get to it and stood to go. She thanked him for the coffee. He walked her to the door. Lila called from the kitchen table without looking up from her dragon close-up. "Bye, Sloane." Sloane. Not Ms. Carrington. Sloane. In the uncomplicated way children used first names when they decided someone was acceptable. No ceremony, no deference, just the name because the name was what they'd been given. Sloane turned toward her. "Bye, Lila. The dragon looks better with more teeth." Lila looked up with an expression of genuine vindication. "That's exactly what I said." Cole made a sound that might have been the beginning of a laugh, suppressed on its way out so it emerged as something smaller. Sloane caught it and looked at him, and he looked at her, and for a moment they were just two people standing in a doorway sharing the particular warmth of a child saying exactly the right wrong thing. Then she was down the porch steps and back in her car. She sat there for a moment before starting the engine. The maple tree moved in the small wind. The frog boots were still on the step. The bent training wheel bracket caught the pale November light and threw it back in a thin line. This house was not her life. Everything about it was not her life. The mess and the scale of it, the smallness and the particular warmth of something built around a child's needs rather than an adult's ambitions. She had a 3,000 square foot penthouse with a view of the entire city, and she had not once, in 2 years of living there, felt the specific quality of inhabited that she'd felt in the first 30 seconds inside that pale yellow Cape Cod. She started the car. She was not sentimental. She was not someone who idealized other people's lives or imagined that disorder was somehow more authentic than order. She had built herself into what she was through a great deal of focused and uncomfortable work, and she was not going to romanticize someone else's circumstances just because they were different from hers. But she thought about the photograph above the couch. Lila on Cole's shoulders at the fair, arms out, mouth open, laughing at something below the frame. And Cole's face in it, she'd only glanced, but she'd registered it. His face not looking at the camera, but looking up at Lila. The expression on it, the expression of a man who has, in that specific moment, all the reason he needs. She thought about what it would take to be that, to someone, to be someone's whole reason. She drove back to the city and went up to her penthouse and stood in the kitchen. She barely cooked in and looked at the view she'd stopped seeing, and she thought, the people who took me knew exactly how to move through my world. They'd studied it. They understood the architecture of my life down to the camera angles. But they hadn't accounted for Cole Vance. They'd looked at a security guard and seen a security guard. They'd done exactly what she had done for 2 years, every time she'd passed him in a hallway, or glanced at his file, or failed to ask any of the questions she should have asked. They'd looked right at him and seen nothing worth worrying about. That was going to be their mistake. 3 days later, the federal investigators came back to Brant with something that made Sloane's stomach drop in a way she hadn't anticipated, even though the shape of it had been visible for a while. The ghost credential hadn't just been used to access routing protocols and camera architecture. It had also accessed the emergency contact information for every senior Carrington executive, including Lila Vance's address, the school she attended, the emergency pickup authorization list, the name of Cole's neighbor, an elderly woman named Helen Marsh who watched Lila on afternoons when Cole's shift ran long. Whoever had planned this had not been planning only for one attempt. They had been building options. They had been building multiple points of pressure, multiple ways in, multiple things that could be threatened if the first approach failed. The first approach had failed. Sloane was on the phone with Cole within 3 minutes of the briefing ending. "I need you to know something," she said. Her voice was steady, and she made it stay that way. "And I need you to hear it before you hear it from anyone else." Silence on his end. The particular silence of someone who has trained themselves to absorb incoming information without reacting until they have all of it. She told him what they'd found. All of it. Lila's school, Helen Marsh's name, the emergency contact list. She didn't soften it. He deserved the plain version, and she gave him the plain version. For a long moment, there was nothing on the line but the quality of him thinking. "When was this accessed?" he said finally. "The access log shows it was pulled 6 weeks ago. Before the kidnapping." "Yes." Another pause. "They were building contingencies," he said. Calm. Terrifyingly calm, the way she'd seen him calm before. Not because he wasn't feeling it, but because the feeling had somewhere to go that wasn't the surface. "If taking you didn't get them what they wanted, they'd need other pressure." "Yes." "They'd come at me through Lila. We don't know that they intended to act on it, but we can't assume they didn't." A long silence. Longer than the others. When he spoke again, his voice had the same surface calm, but she could hear something underneath it that hadn't been there before. Not panic, not anger exactly, but something close to anger that had been compressed into a very small, very dense space. "What do you need from me?" he said. "I need you to let us put a protective detail on Lila and on Helen Marsh." Quietly. "People who look like parents waiting for school pickup, not armed escorts." "Okay. And I need you to know—" She stopped. "I need you to know that I understand what I'm asking you to accept, that because of your connection to me, your daughter is in the crosshairs of people who are willing to use whatever they can reach." She paused. "If you want to step back from all of this, the consulting arrangement, everything, I will not hold that against you, not for a second." She heard him breathe. Just once, a slow breath that she could hear because the line was very quiet. "No," he said. "Cole, no," he said again, and this time there was something in it that closed the question down absolutely. The same tone she'd heard him use with Lila about the paint, and she understood now that it wasn't a dismissive tone, it was the tone of someone who had decided and was not interested in undeciding. "They pulled my daughter's name from a file," he said. "They put it on a list of things they could use. They decided she was a tool." His voice was very quiet, very level. "I've let a lot of things go in my life. That's not one of them." Sloane held the phone against her ear in the kitchen of her penthouse, with the city spread out behind her through the windows, and she felt very clearly the difference between the person she'd been before the night in that building and whoever she was becoming in the days since. "Then let's finish this," she said. "Yeah," he said. "Let's finish it." The protective detail on Lila went into place within 18 hours. Sloane had insisted on hand-selecting the 2 agents herself. A woman named Reyes, who had done protective work for federal judges, and a man named Abbott, who was former military police and had a daughter the same age as Lila, and understood intuitively that the best way to protect a child was to be invisible to her. They picked up Lila's routine without disrupting it. Reyes sat in a car 2 houses down from Helen Marsh's place on the afternoons Cole worked late. Abbott stood near the school entrance looking like every other parent waiting for the 3:15 bell. Cole knew they were there. He didn't say much about it, but Sloane noticed the way he checked his phone less during the working hours after the detail went up. A small change in a man who wasn't given to visible tension, but she noticed it. They set up a working space in a small conference room on the 39th floor, separate from Brandt's security operation, and separate from the executive suite where people would ask questions she wasn't ready to answer. The room had a long table, a whiteboard, a window that looked north toward Maryland, and 3 mismatched chairs that had migrated from other rooms over time. Cole came in every morning by 7:30. Sloane was usually there before him. They worked alongside the federal team but slightly apart from it. Cole reviewing security logs and access records and building a picture from the inside while the agents worked their investigative channels from the outside. And Sloane moving between both operations as the person who understood the company well enough to interpret what each side was finding. It was not a smooth operation. The federal lead, an agent named Dorsey, who was thorough and competent and held a fundamental skepticism about private sector involvement in federal investigations that he made no effort to conceal, spent the first week treating Cole with the particular professional neutrality of someone who hadn't yet decided whether to trust a civilian consultant and was managing that uncertainty by being scrupulously courteous and sharing as little as possible. Cole appeared not to notice. He worked with what he had and didn't push for what he didn't have, and on the 6th day he produced an analysis of the ghost credential access pattern that so precisely anticipated what Dorsey's own team had been building toward. That the agent came to the conference room, stood in the doorway for a moment looking at the whiteboard, and then said, without ceremony, "How'd you get here?" "Process of elimination," Cole said. The accesses were spaced to avoid triggering your anomaly detection threshold, but they weren't random. They follow a rhythm. Same day of week, rotated across a 5-week pattern. Someone was doing this on a schedule they already kept, something that gave them regular late-night access to a workstation without looking unusual. Dorsey came into the room fully. "You're describing someone with a standing late-night work habit. Someone whose regular hours already included 2 to 4 a.m. at least once every 5 weeks. Something like a quarterly reporting cycle or an on-call rotation." Cole looked at the whiteboard. "That's your filter." Dorsey was quiet for a moment. Then he looked at Sloane. "Your deputy CTO." "Garrett Foles has an on-call rotation for infrastructure incidents," she said. "He's listed as first responder for any critical system failure outside business hours. It rotates, but he takes it heavily. He's the kind of executive who doesn't fully trust anyone else to handle a crisis. That habit would give him regular, legitimate cover for late-night system access." "Yes." Dorsey looked at Cole again. Something had shifted in the agent's expression. Not warmth exactly, but the absence of the managed neutrality that had been there before. "Navy," he said. 14 years. "Thought so." Dorsey pulled out the third mismatched chair and sat down. "Show me the rest." After that, the operation moved differently. Faster and with less friction, the two sides finally working from the same table instead of parallel to each other. Sloane watched Cole in those sessions, the way he communicated with Dorsey's team, the precision of it, the absence of any need to be the smartest person in the room, so long as the room was moving toward the right answer. He'd been like that in the building on the night she was taken too, she realized. No performance, just the work. What the work revealed, over the following 10 days, was worse than she'd anticipated, and also, in hindsight, more coherent than the random pieces had suggested. Garrett Foles had been approached by a competitor, a defense technology firm called Meridian Consolidated, headquartered in Atlanta, that had been positioning itself for the same federal contracts Carrington was pursuing, with less success and growing desperation as the procurement timelines tightened. The approach had been made 2 years ago, almost exactly 1 month after Richard Carrington's death, when the transition to Sloane's leadership had left the company briefly uncertain of itself. Foles had been recruited slowly and carefully, not with a single large payment that would show up obviously in his finances, but with a series of consulting arrangements routed through an LLC his brother-in-law operated, each individually below reporting thresholds, collectively adding up to something significant. In exchange, he'd given Meridian's people access to Carrington's strategic roadmap, procurement strategy, and key personnel information over 18 months. The kidnapping had not been Meridian's first idea. It had been their last resort, after a sequence of competitive intelligence maneuvers that had failed to move the needle on the contract awards the way they'd hoped. The plan had been not to harm Sloane, but to hold her long enough to extract signatures on a document that would have rerouted a critical government contract into a bidding structure that advantaged Meridian, framed as a crisis negotiation conducted under duress. It was, as federal crimes went, both elaborate and short-sighted. Elaborate because of how much infrastructure they'd built to make it work. Short-sighted because they'd failed to account for Cole. They did their research on everyone in the building, Dorsey told them, on the morning the final picture came together. Background checks, personnel files, the works. Everything they could pull. He paused. Vance's file showed prior military service, but no specifics. His records are substantially redacted. All they saw was a security guard. Cole said nothing to this. He was looking at the evidence board, which by now covered most of one wall of the conference room. Photographs, documents, connection lines, The accumulated architecture of something that had taken 2 years to build and 10 days to dismantle. The executives at Meridian who authorized this, Sloane said. What's the exposure? Criminal conspiracy, kidnapping facilitation, corporate espionage under federal statute. Dorsey's voice was professionally flat. Significant exposure. Their legal teams are going to have a difficult winter. And Foles. He's looking at federal charges. Cooperation may affect the outcome, but the conduct is documented extensively enough that cooperation only does so much. Dorsey paused. We'll be moving on him today. Sloane nodded. She looked at the wall of evidence for a moment, then at Cole, who was still looking at it too, his expression unreadable in the way it sometimes was when he was processing something he hadn't finished processing. You all right? She said quietly. Yeah. He said it in the direction of the wall rather than at her. Just 11 years he's worked here, 11 years under your family's name, and he was walking out with the company's strategy every quarter for the last 2. People make choices, she said. Sometimes the choices are about fear, sometimes about greed, sometimes you can't tell the difference from the outside. He looked at her then. Can you tell the difference with him? She thought about Garrett Foles, his careful performance reviews, his genuine seeming grief at her father's funeral, the way he'd always had the right thing to say in every meeting, the impeccable institutional loyalty of a man who had been quietly doing the opposite for 2 years. Greed, she said, with some fear underneath it. He saw the transition after my father died, and he calculated that the company might not hold together under me, and he decided to hedge his position, and then the hedge became the thing. Cole nodded slowly. The worst betrayals are always from people who told themselves they had good reasons. Yes, she said, they are. Dorsey's team picked Foles up at his home in Bethesda at 10:15 that morning. Sloane learned about it through a text from Brant that said simply, done. She was in her office when she got it, standing at the window she'd started looking out of again. Sometime in the past month, she'd started looking at the city rather than through it, which was a change she hadn't consciously made but noticed now that it had happened. She texted Cole. He replied with a single word, good. She stared at that word for a moment, then put the phone in her jacket pocket and went back to her desk and tried to remember what she'd been doing before all of this started, which turned out to be harder than it should have been. The contract amendment that had been on her desk the night she was taken was still in the same file folder, untouched for nearly a month, and she picked it up and tried to read it and got 3 paragraphs in before she set it back down. She called Patricia. Clear my afternoon, she said. A pause. You have the procurement review it, reschedule it. I'll take the calls from home. Another pause, the kind that said Patricia was recalibrating. In 2 years of working together, Sloane had cleared her afternoon approximately 4 times, and never without a specific reason stated. Of course, Patricia said. Is everything all right? Everything is fine, Sloane said, which was true and also insufficient, and she knew it and said it anyway. Thank you, Patricia. She left the building at 2 o'clock and drove to Arlington without calling first. She'd given up pretending she was going to call first. It clearly wasn't how she was going to operate with him, and she'd made her peace with that. And when Cole answered the door at 3:45, still in his work clothes, he looked at her with the expression of a man who had stopped being surprised by her showing up on his porch. It's done, she said. I know, you texted. I wanted to say it in person. He looked at her for a moment, then he stepped back from the door. Come in. I'm making dinner. It's going to be bad. I'm warning you in advance. She followed him into the kitchen. The evidence of the day was visible in the room in the way days always were in that house. Lila's backpack dropped rather than placed. A permission slip on the counter with a reminder note Cole had written to himself to sign it. The frog boots just inside the back door this time instead of on the front porch. Relocated for reasons that probably made sense to an 8-year-old. Lila was at the kitchen table doing homework, which she was doing with the focused resentment of a child who would vastly prefer to be doing something else. She looked up when Sloane came in. Hi, she said. Hi, Sloane said. Dad's making pasta, Lila said. He burns the garlic every time. It tastes fine, but it's darker than it should be. The garlic is fine, Cole said from the stove. Last week it was actually black, Lila told Sloane, as someone sharing documented evidence. It was dark brown, Cole said. I have a photograph. Cole looked over his shoulder with an expression that was trying to stay neutral. Why do you have a photograph of garlic? For evidence, Lila said simply, and went back to her homework. Sloane sat in the chair across from Lila, the chair that had become, without any formal designation, the chair she sat in when she was in this kitchen, which was 4 times now over the past 3 weeks. She had not counted intentionally. She knew the number anyway. "What's the homework?" she said. "Fractions," Lila said. "I hate them." "What part?" "All of it." Lila slid the worksheet across the table with the attitude of someone presenting a problem they'd decided was unsolvable. Sloane looked at it. It was equivalent fractions, comparing denominators. "Okay," Sloane said. "Think of it like this." She pulled the worksheet toward her and picked up Lila's pencil and drew a quick rectangle, divided it into sections. If you cut a pizza into 4 pieces and eat one, that's 1/4. If you cut the same pizza into 8 pieces and eat 2, you have the same amount of pizza, Lila said slowly. Right. The fractions look different, but they're describing the same thing. Lila stared at the worksheet with an expression that shifted from hostility to something more like reluctant engagement. "That's actually not as stupid as I thought it was," she said. "High praise," Sloane said. Cole made a sound from the stove. She looked up and found him watching the two of them with an expression she hadn't seen on him before, open in a way he usually wasn't, something unguarded and careful at the same time. The look of someone watching a thing he'd hoped for without letting himself expect it. He looked away when she caught him. "Pasta in 10 minutes, he said, to no one in particular. She stayed for dinner. The pasta was, as advertised, fine except for the garlic, which was several shades darker than optimal, but not inedible. They ate at the small table by the window. The dining table was still covered in Lila's art projects, which had expanded over the past 2 weeks into what appeared to be a series of illustrated stories involving the dragon from the earlier painting, now named Gerald, who had a complicated life. Cole had cleared a path through the projects for the plates and silverware and hadn't said anything about cleaning it up, which Sloane had come to understand was characteristic of how he operated the house. He maintained the things that mattered, a clean kitchen, and Lila's laundry done, and the homework finished, and he let the rest exist in whatever shape it took. After dinner, Lila showed Sloane the Gerald series. It was 6 pages now, carefully drawn and labeled in Lila's handwriting, which was large and slightly uneven and completely committed to its own system of spelling. Gerald the dragon wanted to live in a regular house, but nobody would rent to him because of the fire. He was trying to prove he could control it. The current installment had him attending what appeared to be a fire safety class. "Does he succeed?" Sloane asked. "Not yet," Lila said seriously. "He has to learn it properly first. You can't just decide you're going to be different. You have to practice." Sloane looked at the page. "That's true," she said. "I know," Lila said, with the confidence of someone who had arrived at this conclusion independently and felt good about it. Cole put Lila to bed at 8:30, which involved a negotiation over the reading light that had clearly been ongoing for some time and ended with an agreement Sloane could hear from the kitchen, where she'd stayed at the table with a second cup of coffee, that Lila could read for 15 minutes, but the book had to be a calm one and not the Dragon Encyclopedia, because it was too exciting and she'd be awake until midnight. Lila's response to this was inaudible, but Cole's quiet laugh in response to it was not. He came back downstairs at 8:55 and poured himself coffee and sat across from her at the small table by the window. Outside, the street was quiet. A neighbor's porch light was on. Somewhere down the block, someone's dog was making a half-hearted case for being let back inside. "How are you doing with all of it?" he said. "Now that it's over." She considered the question, not the reflex answer, the one she gave Patricia and Brandt in her board chair, the one that was competent and forward-looking and conveyed that she had processed the experience and extracted the lessons and was moving on in an organized fashion, the actual answer. "I keep going back to the room," she said, "the building they took me to, not in a—" She paused. "It's not nightmares or anything like that. It's more like I keep trying to figure out what I was thinking in there." "What were you thinking?" "I was thinking about who had access to my route. Even then, I was running security analysis in my head while I was zip-tied to a chair." She looked at her coffee. "I don't know if that's a strength or a problem." "Probably both," Cole said, "depending on the situation." "I also thought about my father." She paused. "I kept thinking, what would he tell me to do right now? And the honest answer is, I don't know, because I spent most of my 20s believing I was building myself independently of him, and then he died, and I took the job, and I've been trying to be him ever since. And I don't actually know what I would do if I weren't trying to be him. Cole was quiet for a moment. What do you think you'd do? I don't know. Something smaller. Something more. She stopped, looking for the word. My father believed in scale. In impact as a function of size. I've inherited that as an operating principle, and I've never questioned whether it's actually mine. She paused. The only time I've felt clearly like myself in the past 2 years is in rooms where I'm looking at a specific problem with specific people and we're working toward a specific answer. Not the board meetings, not the shareholder calls, the actual work. Like the conference room on 39, he said. Yes. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. The blue paint was gone from his knuckle, long gone, days ago. But she noticed she still looked at that spot sometimes. You're good at it, he said. The actual work. Better than you give yourself credit for. You've only seen me in a crisis. Crises are when you see people most accurately, he said. Everything else is performance. Good crisis, bad crisis, doesn't matter. It's just who you are when the usual structures fall away. He paused. You were clear. You were direct. You didn't freeze, and you didn't pretend to be in less trouble than you were. You made a decision to trust me, which you had no particular reason to do at that point, and you executed it without second-guessing yourself. He paused again. That's not nothing. She looked at him. You're better at noticing people than you let on. Occupational habit. From the SEALs? From raising a kid alone, he said. When it's just the two of you, you learn to pay attention. You miss things otherwise. He looked out the window. Lila lets me know when I'm not paying attention. She doesn't do it on purpose. She just changes, gets quieter. Something shifts, and I've learned to catch it earlier than I used to. How long has it been the two of you? 6 years, he said. Since she was 2. He was quiet for a moment. You find a rhythm. You stop waiting for it to feel less like everything is balanced on one leg, and you just learn to balance on one leg. And then one day you realize you've actually gotten pretty good at it, which would be more satisfying if someone else had noticed. He said the last part with a slight dryness that she understood was as close as he came to humor about something that wasn't funny. People didn't notice, she said. People see a single dad, and they either feel sorry for you or they're impressed in a way that's actually also feeling sorry for you. Nobody looks at it and thinks, he's built something real here. They think, poor guy, managing. He shrugged one shoulder, which is fine. I stopped needing people to see it a while ago. I see it, she said. He looked at her. I've been in this house 5 times, she said. I've seen what you've built here. It's not... She paused, making sure she was saying what she actually meant rather than what was easy to say. It's not impressive the way something you show people is impressive. It's impressive the way something true is impressive. Lila knows exactly who she is. She argues with you about garlic with documented photographic evidence. She's writing illustrated stories about a dragon learning to control fire. She paused. You did that. A kid who feels that safe and that herself, that's a choice somebody made every day for 6 years. Cole was very still. The kind of still she'd come to understand was not absence, but the opposite. The stillness of someone receiving something they hadn't been prepared to receive and were deciding what to do with it. She's the best thing I've ever done, he said quietly, by a distance that doesn't compare to anything else. I know, Sloane said. It shows. They sat in the comfortable quiet of the kitchen, the kind of quiet that didn't need to be filled. Outside, the neighbor's dog had apparently been let in. The street was fully still now. The porch light down the block went out. I want to do something, Sloane said. She'd been building toward it for a week and had not found the right way in, and she had decided finally that there wasn't a right way in, and she'd simply have to say it and see what happened. With the company. Something separate from operations. She paused. There are veterans working jobs like the one you were working, not because it's what they want to do, but because it's what was available when everything else closed. And most of them are carrying something, not all of it visible, not all of it acknowledged. And the systems that were supposed to help them mostly don't. She paused. I want to build something that does. Counseling, employment pathways, family assistance. Something that actually functions instead of just existing. She looked at him. And I want you to run it. Cole said nothing. Not because of what you've done for me, she said. Or not only because of that. Because you understand what it feels like from the inside. You know what a person needs because you needed it, and either found it the hard way or didn't find it at all. That's not something I can hire. He was looking at the table, the same place he'd looked in the coffee shop on Meridian, all those weeks ago, when she'd said something he was processing. "I'm not a program director," he said. "You're not a security guard either, but you were excellent at it." He looked up at that, and the slight dryness she'd noticed before came back into his expression. "That's a low bar." "Then exceed it. You're good at exceeding low bars." She held his gaze. "I'm not asking you to transform into something different. I'm asking you to do what you already do. Pay attention to people who need to be paid attention to, and figure out what they need and find a way to give it to them. You've been doing that your whole life. I'm suggesting we put some infrastructure behind it." He was quiet for long enough that she heard Lila's reading light click off upstairs, 15 minutes, exactly as negotiated, and the small sound of a child settling into sleep. "What do you call it?" he said finally. "I haven't decided. I thought you might have an opinion." He almost smiled. "Second watch," he said. "In the military, the second watch is the hardest. Middle of the night, everyone's tired, and you still have to hold the line." He paused. "Coming home is the second watch. After the service. That's when most people fall." She looked at him. "Second watch foundation," she said. "Yes." He nodded slowly. "I'd want to do it right. Not quickly. I'd want to talk to people who've tried this before. What worked, what didn't. I'd want Lila's school schedule protected. I'd want whatever you need," she said. "That's not a negotiation. Whatever you need to do it right is what you'll have." He looked at her for a long moment. In the window behind him, she could see the reflection of the kitchen, the table, the mismatched chairs, the art projects on the dining table behind them, and her own face in the glass, which she looked at briefly and then looked away from. "Your father would have done something like this," Cole said. "My father did do something like this," she said. "He looked after you." "One person." "He started with one person. That was his style." She paused. "Mine might be different." Cole put both hands flat on the table, the gesture of someone who has arrived at something and is marking it. Okay, he said. She exhaled something she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "Okay. I want to sleep on the exact structure, and I want to talk to Lila. Not about details, but she should know her dad is doing something different. She deserves a conversation." "Of course." He stood and picked up both coffee cups and took them to the sink. She stood too, reaching for her jacket. The evening had gone later than she'd planned, which it always did in this house, and she'd long since stopped feeling apologetic about that. "Sloane," he said. She turned. He was at the sink, not looking at her, rinsing the cups with the economical attention he brought to small tasks. "Thank you," he said, he paused, "for seeing it. What I built here. Most people look at this house and see what's missing." He turned the faucet off. "You looked at it and saw what's there." She stood in the kitchen doorway with her jacket half on, and she thought about the photograph above the couch. Lila on his shoulders, arms out, mouth open, laughing, and Cole looking up at her with all the reason he needed in his face. "It's not hard to see," she said quietly. "If you're actually looking." She let herself out the front door. The night was cold now, properly November cold, the kind that found the gaps in your jacket and reminded you that the year was ending. She went down the porch steps past the frog boots and along the leaf-covered path to her car and sat there for a moment with the engine off. She thought about what he'd said in the kitchen. You stop waiting for it to feel less like everything is balanced on one leg, and you just learn to balance on one leg. She'd been doing a version of that for 2 years, running the company on one leg because the other one, the one that was supposed to be her father, her actual father, not the institutional memory of him, but the actual man, was gone and had left a gap she'd been stepping around every day without naming what it was. She thought about Gerald the dragon in Lila's story, attending fire safety class because you can't just decide you're going to be different, you have to practice. She started the car. 3 weeks later, in the pale gray light of a December morning, federal prosecutors filed charges against 3 Meridian Consolidated executives and Garrett Foles in connection with the kidnapping and corporate espionage conspiracy. The coverage was substantial. Defense industry news, regional business press, 2 national outlets that picked it up for the corporate crime angle. Carrington Strategic Technologies put out a statement, carefully worded by legal, that confirmed the company's full cooperation with federal investigators and expressed confidence in the outcome. Sloane read the coverage in the morning and felt less than she'd expected to feel. Not nothing. There was a specific satisfaction in watching something that had aimed at her miss and then collapse under its own weight, but less than the vindication she'd anticipated. The charges were a conclusion, not a resolution. Resolution was something different. Resolution was the conference room on 39, slowly dismantled now, the whiteboard clean, the evidence board gone, the mismatched chairs returned to wherever they'd come from. Resolution was Cole walking into her office that same morning with a yellow legal pad covered in his handwriting. Notes from 2 conversations he'd had the previous week with veterans advocacy organizations in Virginia and Maryland, the beginning of due diligence on what Second Watch could learn from what had already been tried. "Sit down," she said. He sat in the chair across from her desk, the chair her board members sat in, her senior VPs, her legal team. He sat in it the same way he sat in the mismatched chair on 39 and the chair at the small table in his kitchen, without adjusting his posture to the context, without performing anything for the room or for her. Just himself, in a chair, with a legal pad covered in notes. She thought briefly about the night she'd sat in his truck with her hands still shaking from the zip ties, and tried to understand what she was feeling and had recognized it as safety, the particular quality of being safe when you expected not to be. She felt it again now. Not the crisis version, the ordinary version, the version that came from knowing that the person across from you was exactly who they appeared to be, no more and no less, and that this was, in a world full of people who were performing something genuinely rare. "Tell me what you found," she said. He flipped open the legal pad. "All right," he said, "here's what works and what doesn't." And they got to work. The annual Carrington Strategic Technologies shareholder meeting was held every January in the company's main conference center on the 40th floor, a room that could seat 300 and typically did, filled with the particular mix of institutional investors, board members, senior executives, and financial press that gathered once a year to hear how the company had performed and where it intended to go. Sloane had run 2 of these meetings before. She knew the rhythm of them, the opening financials, the strategic outlook, the Q&A that was carefully managed to allow the appearance of challenge without actual disruption. She was good at them in the way she was good at most things that required precision and composure in front of an audience. This one was going to be different. She'd told Patricia 3 days before. Patricia had listened without expression, written down what was needed, and then looked up and said, "The board chair is going to want a preview." "He'll get the same thing everyone else gets," Sloane said. "On the day." Patricia had made the exhale. "He's not going to like that." "He'll manage." What she hadn't told Patricia, hadn't told anyone, including Cole, was the full shape of what she intended to say. She'd told Cole about the Second Watch Foundation weeks ago, in his kitchen over bad coffee and pasta with slightly burned garlic. She told him she wanted to announce it at the shareholder meeting. She hadn't told him she intended to bring him onto the stage to do it, because she'd known that if she told him in advance, he would spend the intervening weeks constructing reasons why that was unnecessary, and she needed him there, and she wasn't going to give him the opportunity to argue his way out of it. She was aware this was not entirely fair. She was doing it anyway. The morning of the meeting, she arrived at the building at 6:30 t, 2 hours before the first attendees would come through the door. She went to her office and sat at her desk and looked at the city, which was still mostly dark at that hour. The winter sun not yet up. The lights of DC laid out below her like something that wanted to be beautiful and mostly was. She thought about her father. She did this less than she used to, the constant involuntary consultation of his imagined opinion, the running his voice through her decisions to see how they held up. She'd been doing it so long after his death that she'd almost stopped noticing it, the way you stop noticing a sound that's always present. But she noticed it now because it was fading. Not because she'd forgotten him or stopped missing him, but because she'd started to develop something of her own that didn't need the constant triangulation. What she was going to do this morning was hers. She'd built it from something he'd started, the original act of looking after a teenage boy who'd done the right thing at personal cost. But she was taking it somewhere he hadn't mapped, and she was doing it in her own way, not his. She thought he'd have appreciated that. He was difficult and complicated and had made choices that hurt people and had been hard to fully know, but he had always genuinely wanted her to become something that was her own. She picked up her phone and called Cole at 7:15. He answered on the second ring. "I'm already in the building," he said. "You're here?" "Came in early. Figured you might want to go over the remarks. A pause. Also, I knew you'd call early. She almost laughed. I need you to do something today that I should have asked you about sooner. A silence. The particular kind that preceded his processing of something he hadn't been told yet. All right? I'm bringing you on stage during the announcement of Second Watch. I want you there in person. A longer silence. Cole? I heard you. It matters that the people in that room see who you are. Not hear about you, not read a bio in the program. See you. She paused. The foundation means something specific if they understand where it comes from. It means something general if I just announce it as a corporate initiative. I need them to understand where it comes from. She heard him breathe. Once, slow, the same measured breath she'd heard on the phone the night she'd told him about Lila's name in the access logs. You could have asked me this before today, he said. I know. You didn't because you knew I'd have things to say about it. Yes. Another silence. Somewhere in the background she could hear the building's ambient hum, the HVAC, the distant sound of the early cleaning crew, the particular quiet of a large building before the people filled it. I'm not a public speaker, he said. You don't have to speak if you don't want to. Stand next to me. That's enough. That feels worse, he said, standing there not saying anything. Then say something. Like what? Whatever's true, she said. That's always worked for you before. He was quiet for a moment. You could have given me a week with this. I know. I'm sorry. You're not sorry. She paused. I'm a little sorry. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite exasperation, but was somewhere between the two in a place that was entirely his own. What time? 10 o'clock. I'll come find you at 9:45. I'll be on 39, he said. I'm still finishing the program notes for the foundation structure. He hung up. She sat with the phone in her hand for a moment and felt the small compressed warmth of someone who has done something they knew was right and also knew was going to cost them a conversation later that they deserved to have. At 9:45, she went to the 39th floor. Cole was at the long table with his legal pad and a laptop that was older than anything else in the building, probably, running a program budget spreadsheet that he'd built himself after declining twice to let Carrington's finance team build it for him, on the grounds that he needed to understand every number before he put his name on it. He was in a dark suit she hadn't seen before, not expensive, but correct. The suit of a man who had owned one good suit for a long time and kept it that way. He looked up when she came in. He looked, in that suit, in that room, more like himself than she'd ever seen him look in a uniform, which was something she hadn't expected and didn't quite have language for. You look good, she said. I look like someone who borrowed a suit, he said. You look like someone who doesn't need the suit to tell people who he is, she said, which is better. He stood and pushed the laptop aside. He was a few inches taller than her, and in the quiet of the empty conference room, the distance between them felt different than it did in a kitchen with the child nearby, or in a federal briefing with agents at the table. More present, more specific. If I say something wrong up there, he said, you won't. But if I do, I'll smooth it over. That's what I do. She paused. But you won't. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he nodded once, the same nod she'd seen him give when he'd made a decision and was done making it. Okay, he said, let's go. The conference center was full when they came in from the side entrance at 1 minute to 10. 300 people in a room that seated 300 had a specific sound and a specific temperature, the accumulated warmth of that many bodies, the low-level noise of conversation dropping as the arrival of the main speaker was registered and the room began to quiet itself. Sloane walked to the podium. Cole stood to her left, a few feet back, in the posture of someone who was precisely where he'd decided to be and was not adjusting for the audience. She began with the financials. Revenue, contracts, strategic positioning, the year's performance against projections. She was precise and clear and moved through it at the pace of someone who had prepared thoroughly and was not going to belabor the numbers when the numbers spoke adequately for themselves. The room was attentive. The board members in the front row were attentive in the particular way of people waiting to see if anything unexpected was going to happen. Something unexpected was going to happen. She got to it at the 20-minute mark, after the strategic outlook section, when the natural pause came that usually preceded Q&A. Before we open for questions, she said, I want to share something that isn't in the prepared materials." The room shifted slightly. The particular shift of 300 people all adjusting their attention by the same small increment at the same moment. "Most of you know that I was the target of a kidnapping attempt in October," she said. Her voice was even. She'd decided weeks ago that she was going to say this plainly, without the softening language that corporate communications had suggested. Incident, security event, unfortunate situation. It was a kidnapping attempt. She was going to call it what it was. The perpetrators had inside access to this company's systems, inside knowledge of my movements, and the operational capacity to bypass an extensive security infrastructure. She paused. They failed. Not because our systems performed as designed. They didn't. They failed because of one person. She turned slightly toward Cole. Cole Vance has been a member of this company's security team for 6.5 years. He was recruited to this company by my father, Richard Carrington, and I want to explain why. She told the room about the dog, about the 7-year-old girl who had wandered 2 blocks from her caretaker and been cornered between 2 parked cars by an animal that had gotten loose from a yard, about the 16-year-old boy who had put himself between the child and the dog and taken 40 stitches and never asked anyone for anything in return. She told it plainly, without theater, and the room was completely silent in the way rooms go silent when they understand they are hearing something real. My father spent 23 years looking for a way to repay a debt that the person who was owed it never believed was a debt, she said. He gave Cole a job in this building because it was the only thing Cole would accept. She paused. And Cole has been in this building ever since, working night security shifts, raising his daughter alone, and apparently keeping an eye on me in a way I was far too careless to notice. She turned to Cole. I was looking at her with an expression she'd never seen on him before. Not the professional calm, not the careful stillness. Something younger than those things. Something that had been kept in a room a long time and had just had the door opened. Before he came to this company, she said, addressing the room again, Cole Vance served 14 years as a United States Navy SEAL. He was decorated for valor in multiple operations. He left the service carrying wounds that weren't visible to anyone who looked at him, and he built a life that was, from the outside, small and quiet, and was from the inside the hardest and most honest thing I have ever personally witnessed. She stopped for a moment, not for effect, because she needed the moment. He found me in an abandoned building in Northern Virginia, she said, in the dark, in a situation I had no idea how to get out of. He walked in alone and got me out. And when I asked him why, he said, because nobody should have gotten to you tonight, and they did. So, she let that sit for a moment. The room was very still. I misjudged him for 2 years, she said. I looked at his job title and I thought I understood who he was. I did not. And I want to say that in this room, in front of every person in this company, because I think the most important thing a leader can do when they've been wrong is say so specifically and out loud. Not generally, specifically. I was wrong about this man. She looked at Cole. Come up here, she said quietly. He walked to the podium. He did it the way he did everything. No wasted motion, no performance. And he stood beside her at the front of the room, and 300 people looked at him, and he looked back at them with the directness of someone who had decided that if he was going to be here, he was going to be here without apology. I'm not a speaker, he said. His voice carried. He had a voice that carried without effort. The voice of someone trained to communicate clearly in conditions where clarity was the difference between outcomes. I don't have a prepared statement. Sloane told me this morning that I'd be standing here, which I'm going to have words with her about later. Something moved through the room. Not quite laughter. Something warmer than that. The sound of 300 people relaxing at once because the man at the front of the room had just been entirely himself. I did what I did in October because it was the right thing, he said. That's the complete explanation. There's nothing complicated in it. He paused. The complicated part comes after. When you spend your career being trained to act decisively in impossible situations, and then the situation ends, and you have to figure out who you are when there's no impossible situation to act in. He paused again. I spent 6 years figuring that out badly, working a job that didn't ask much of me, which was what I thought I wanted, and raising my daughter, which was the best thing in my life and also the only thing that kept me honest about who I was still trying to become. He looked out at the room. I don't know most of you. I know this building pretty well. I know which elevator has the slow door and which floor the coffee is drinkable on. but I don't know most of you as people. What I know is that a lot of you served, or you know people who served, or you work adjacent to service in the way that everyone in this industry does. And most of those people, most of us, are carrying something we haven't put down yet and haven't found the right place to put. He paused. Second Watch Foundation is going to try to be that place. Not because Sloane wants a corporate initiative, because I know what it costs to carry it alone, and I know it doesn't have to cost that much if somebody is actually paying attention. The room was quiet when he finished. Then it was not quiet. The applause was not the polished kind that corporate events produced, the measured appreciation of an audience that had been entertained according to plan. It was the other kind. The kind that came from the chest, that started at the front and moved backward through the room, that carried in it something the people producing it maybe hadn't expected to feel when they sat down with their programs and their coffee an hour ago. Sloane stood beside Cole and looked out at it, all of it, the room and the faces and the sound, and felt something settle in her that had been unsettled for a long time. She committed $12 million to Second Watch that morning, announced from the podium with the specificity her father had always insisted on. Not a pledge subject to board approval, not a gesture in the direction of a number. 12 million, committed, allocated, beginning immediately. The board chair in the front row had an expression that was doing several things simultaneously, and she made a note to have that conversation later and to enjoy it only a moderate amount. After the meeting, after the Q&A and the handshakes and the press questions that her communications team fielded with the carefully prepared language she'd approved the previous week, after the board chair had indeed cornered her with his expression still doing several things simultaneously, and she had walked him through the financial structure and the reputational calculus until he arrived, reluctantly, at the conclusion that she'd done this correctly. After all of that, she found Cole in the corridor outside the conference center, talking to two people she didn't recognize at first. Then she recognized them. Reyes and Abbott, the details she'd put on Lila. They were in civilian clothes, off the clock now that the threat had been formally dismantled, and they were talking to Cole with the particular ease of people who had spent 6 weeks watching someone's child and had come to feel something about that child and its father. Reyes was showing Cole something on her phone, a photograph it looked like. Cole looked at it and made a sound she could hear from 10 feet away, something between exhaustion and amusement, and shook his head. She came closer. The photograph on Reyes' phone was Lila, apparently taken sometime in the past weeks from the protective detail position, in front of her school, in an enormous winter coat that had been zipped all the way to the chin so that her face emerged from it like something looking out of a sleeping bag. She was holding what appeared to be a sign she'd made herself, marker on poster board, that said, "Official School Greeter." And she was greeting, very seriously, every person who walked through the school entrance, pointing at her sign and nodding. She did this for 3 days, Reyes said. Every morning. I have 6 photos. She didn't tell me, Cole said. She probably thought it was obvious, Sloane said. Cole looked at her. Something had loosened in him since the stage, some held thing that had been let go. And what was underneath it was not vulnerability exactly, but the place that came just before it, where a person was still themselves but less defended. She's going to want a full report, he said. About today. She'll have questions. Tell her the dragon story worked, Sloane said. Gerald learning to control the fire. She'll know what I mean. He looked at her for a moment. You're going to have to explain that to me. Ask Lila, she said. She'll explain it better. He smiled then. Not the almost smile she'd been cataloging for months. Not the suppressed almost laugh. An actual smile, unhurried, reaching the corners of his eyes, changing his whole face into something she hadn't seen before because she'd never seen him fully put his guard down until this moment in a corridor outside a conference center with Reyes showing him photographs on a phone. It was a good face, she thought. It was a very good face. The months that followed were not a smooth unfolding of good outcomes. Nothing real ever was. Second Watch's first office was a rented space in a building in Arlington, 4 blocks from Cole's house, deliberately chosen so that he could walk to work and be home for Lila's school pickup without fighting traffic. The office had old carpet and a heating system that worked when it felt like it, and a view of a parking garage. And Cole spent 3 weeks setting it up with the same methodical care he brought to everything, one thing correctly done before the next thing started. No shortcuts, no performance for anyone who might be watching. The first staff he hired were 2 people. A veterans counselor named Marcus, who had done this work for a nonprofit in Baltimore for 8 years, and had left because the nonprofit's leadership had stopped actually listening to the people they served, and an administrative coordinator named Diane, who was 57 years old and had spent 30 years as an Army family support coordinator and knew the system's failures from the inside out. They were not glamorous hires. They were the right hires. The first program cohort was 11 veterans. Cole knew 3 of them personally, from networks that survived service even when service itself had ended. The particular bonds that didn't require maintenance because they'd been forged in conditions that made maintenance beside the point. The other 8 came through referrals from the veterans advocacy organizations he'd spent months building relationships with, the ones that trusted Second Watch because Cole had shown up in person, repeatedly, and listened more than he talked. It was not a smooth operation. The counseling program needed more capacity than Marcus alone could provide by week 3, which required bringing in 2 contract counselors on a schedule that Diane managed with the organized precision of someone who had spent 3 decades managing family logistics under military conditions and found this comparatively straightforward. The Employment Pathway Program had a gap in its manufacturing sector connections that took 6 weeks to close. 2 of the 11 veterans in the first cohort dropped out. 1 because the timing wasn't right, 1 because the program wasn't what he'd needed, and Cole drove to both of their homes and sat with both of them and didn't try to talk them back into anything, just left the door open and meant it. Both of them came back 3 months later. He didn't make a point of it. He put them into the second cohort and moved on. Sloane watched all of this from the particular distance of someone who had funded a thing and was learning, with some difficulty, not to manage it. She had opinions about pace and structure and resource allocation that she kept largely to herself because she understood that Cole had given her his nights and his schedule and his daughter's school year as the non-negotiable boundaries of how this would work. And the corollary of that was that she didn't get to re-import the pace of corporate operations into something he was building according to different principles. This required active restraint. She was not naturally good at active restraint. She got better at it. She also sold the penthouse. She did it in February, 4 months after the shareholder meeting, and she did it without telling anyone except her real estate attorney and Patricia, who received the information with the same careful neutrality she brought to all information that surprised her. "Where will you go?" Patricia asked. "I found a place in Georgetown," Sloane said. "Smaller. Actual neighbors. A street where people walk dogs." She paused. "It has a kitchen I might actually cook in." "You don't cook," Patricia said. "I'm going to learn." Patricia wrote this down with the expression of someone who was reserving judgment and would be proven right either way. The Georgetown house was a row house, 3 stories, brick, with a small backyard that had a garden the previous owners had abandoned mid-project, half-planted beds, a tool shed with a broken latch, a bird feeder that needed filling. Sloane moved in on a Saturday in late February with the help of a moving company and Patricia's disapproving supervision of the kitchen arrangement, and that evening she sat on the back steps in her moving clothes and looked at the abandoned garden and thought, "I could fix this." She didn't mean the garden specifically, though she did mean that too. Cole and Lila came to see the house the following weekend. Lila conducted a thorough inspection with the focused evaluation she brought to new environments, testing the echo in the front hall, examining the kitchen cabinets, discovering the back garden with an expression that shifted from assessment to something approaching excitement when she spotted the bird feeder. "It needs birds," she said. "It needs food first," Cole said. "Then birds." "We could get the food today," Lila said, with the casual logic of someone for whom the distance between an idea and its execution was always shorter than adults seem to think it was. "We could," Sloane said. Cole looked at her. "You're going to encourage this." "I'm going to participate in it," she said. "There's a difference." He shook his head slowly with the expression he used when he was losing an argument. He hadn't fully entered yet, and Lila was already back inside to get her jacket because she'd apparently decided the bird food acquisition was happening immediately. They went to the hardware store 3 blocks away, all 3 of them, on a gray February afternoon with the cold still genuine and the trees still bare, and bought a bag of mixed seed and a second bird feeder for the other side of the garden, and came back and filled both feeders with the specific mutual focus of people engaged in a small task together that doesn't require discussion, just presence. That evening, Cole and Lila stayed for dinner. Sloane cooked pasta. She'd bought the ingredients before they arrived, with the precise preparation of someone who had decided to learn something and was not going to let imprecision be the obstacle. And she burned the garlic, which Lila noted immediately and with visible satisfaction. "You did the same thing Dad does," she said. "The garlic is fine," Sloane said. "It's darker than it should be," Lila said. "Lila," Cole said. "She did it," Lila said simply. "I'm just saying." Sloane looked at Cole over Lila's head. He was looking back at her with the smile that reached his eyes, the one she'd first seen in the corridor after the shareholder meeting, and she thought about something he'd said once, in his kitchen in the early weeks. You stop waiting for it to feel less like everything is balanced on one leg, and you just learn to balance on one leg. She thought she understood it differently now than she had then. It wasn't about endurance. It wasn't about learning to manage a deficit. It was about discovering that the leg you'd been balancing on had gotten stronger than you'd noticed, and that the thing you'd thought was missing was sometimes just something you hadn't found yet. That spring, Second Watch served 43 veterans across 3 program tracks. Cole presented the first quarter report to a small advisory board that included 2 veterans advocacy leaders, a clinical psychologist who specialized in service-related trauma, and Sloane, who sat at the end of the table and asked 3 questions and said nothing else, and wrote down several things that she did not turn into action items because they were not her action items to take. The report included a section Cole had written himself at the end, after the numbers and the program metrics and the outcome tracking. It was not data. It was a paragraph plainly written about a man in the second program cohort who had come in with a 12-year service record and no civilian employment for 4 years, and a daughter he'd been afraid to let see how lost he was. The man had completed the Employment Pathway program and started work as a facilities manager at a hospital in Falls Church, and had called Cole on a Tuesday night to say he'd taken his daughter to dinner for the first time in 2 years because he finally felt like he had something to report that wasn't just survival. Cole had written the paragraph the way he said everything, without decoration, without making it mean more than it meant, which made it mean everything. Sloane had read it 3 times. She did not say anything about it during the board meeting. Afterward, when everyone else had left, she sat at the table while Cole gathered his materials, and she said, "The paragraph at the end." He looked up. "That's why this exists," she said. "Not the numbers. That." He looked at her for a moment. "The numbers matter," he said. "You can't sustain the thing without the numbers." "I know," she said. "Both things are true." He picked up his legal pad. "Yes," he said. "They are." On a Tuesday evening in late April, Sloane was sitting on the back steps of the Georgetown house when Cole came through the back gate. She'd given him a key 2 months ago, for no reason she'd articulated, and he'd accepted it for no reason he'd articulated either. Lila was at a sleepover. He'd stopped in after a site visit to a partnering organization in Northern Virginia, still in his work jacket, and he came through the gate and sat on the steps beside her without ceremony and looked at the garden, which had begun to show the first tentative evidence that the beds the previous owners had abandoned might actually produce something given minimal encouragement. 2 birds were at the feeder on the left side. Small brown birds, ordinary, nothing that would merit identification in a field guide, but real and present and eating from the feeder she and Lila had filled in February. They sat there for a while without talking. The city was doing its evening things around them. Traffic in the distance, a neighbor's television faintly audible, somewhere a few streets over someone playing music with the window open. "I've been thinking," Cole said. "About?" "The mission," he said. "The one I told you about." She waited. "I've been carrying it as a debt," he said, "for 12 years. Every person I've helped since, Terry on the floor, you in that building, the veterans coming through Second Watch. I've been counting them. Internally. Against the 4 people I couldn't get to in time." He paused. "It's not a ledger. That's what I've figured out. You can't run it like a ledger because the math is wrong. It's not 4 against however many I've saved since. It's just..." He stopped, found the word. "It's just what happened and what I do now. And those are 2 separate things." She looked at him. The evening light was doing the thing it did in April, soft and horizontal, landing on things gently. "When did you figure that out?" "Slowly," he said. "Over a long time. The man who called me from Falls Church about taking his daughter to dinner, that helped." He paused. "You helped." Watching you figure out that you were wrong about me and then actually do something about it instead of just feeling bad about it. That helped. She was quiet for a moment. I'm not sure I've done enough. No one ever is, he said. That's not the same as not doing enough. That's just what it feels like to actually care about something. A third bird had arrived at the feeder. Sloane watched it without moving. Beside her, Cole was close enough that she could feel the warmth of him in the cooling evening, and she thought about all of the distance that had been between them, the years of hallways and past glances, and a file she'd read for 90 seconds, and moved on from, and how little of it had been real distance, and how much of it had just been her own inattention, her own assumption that she already understood what she was looking at. I was lonely, she said, in the penthouse, for 2 years. I didn't say it to myself in those terms because I was too busy to let myself say it, but that's what it was. She paused. I didn't know I was lonely until I sat in your kitchen the first time and felt what it felt like to be in a place that wasn't. He turned his head and looked at her. The careful look. The one that was not managing distance but was instead paying the kind of attention that made distance impossible. Lila likes you, he said, for what it's worth. She told me you're the only adult who takes the garlic complaints seriously. I do take them seriously, Sloane said. The garlic is always darker than it should be. The garlic is fine, he said, which was exactly what she'd known he would say, and she laughed, a real laugh, unplanned, the kind that happened before you decided to let it. And he smiled again, the full one, and they sat on the steps of her Georgetown row house in the April evening with birds at the feeder and the city going about its business around them. He reached over and put his hand over hers. Not dramatic, not a gesture, just there, warm and real and certain in the way he was certain about things once he'd decided them. She turned her hand over. They stayed like that while the light finished going and the first stars, the ones bright enough to show through the city's ambient glow, appeared in the part of the sky directly above the garden. There is a particular kind of person the world produces in modest numbers and tends not to recognize on sight. They don't advertise themselves. They don't arrange themselves to be seen. They show up, they do what the moment requires, and they go home to whatever small life they've built around the people they love, and they do it again the next day. The world moves around them without fully registering what they are, which is the kind of person who holds things together. Not from the top, not from positions of authority or visibility, but from the place where the actual work is done, in the dark, without recognition, because the work matters, and that is sufficient reason. Cole Vance was that person. He'd been that person at 16, throwing himself between a child and an animal because standing still wasn't in him. He'd been that person in 14 years of service, in deployments that the records described only obliquely, and that had cost him things the records didn't mention. He'd been that person in 6 years of night security shifts and school pickups, and Gerald the Dragon and burned garlic, and a legal pad full of notes about what veterans needed that nobody was giving them. He had carried, for 12 years, the weight of 4 people he hadn't gotten to in time, and he had never once put it down on anyone else to carry, had never used it to ask for exemption from the ordinary requirements of a decent life, had simply absorbed it and kept going and built something real and good and true in the shadow of it. What Sloane gave him was not rescue. He didn't need rescue. What she gave him was the specific thing that is harder to give than money or opportunity or recognition. She gave him an accurate witness, someone who looked at what he'd actually built and named it correctly. Someone who said, "This is real, and it counts, and you are allowed to believe that." And what he gave her was equally specific. Not safety in the protected by bodyguard sense, though he'd given her that too. He gave her a house to walk into that smelled like something baked in crayons, a child who documented everything with photographic evidence, a life whose scale was human rather than institutional. He gave her a reason to look out the window again. Lila Vance grew up knowing that the woman who came to their house and burned the garlic and helped her with fractions and took the dragon stories seriously had been someone lost before she found her way to their kitchen table, just like Gerald had been before the fire safety class. She understood, in the way children understood things that were shown to them rather than explained, that people who seemed to have everything sometimes had the particular nothing of a life without witness, and that the work of a family, the real work, not the version that looked good from outside, was the daily practice of seeing each other accurately and staying anyway. On a Wednesday morning the following October, almost exactly 1 year after the night in the abandoned building in Northern Virginia, Sloane arrived at Second Watch's office in Arlington at 8 a.m. and found Cole already there. He was always already there, sitting at his desk with a cup of coffee that had gone cold while he was reading something, which was also always. She put her bag down and went to the small kitchen and made fresh coffee and brought him a cup and sat down across from him, and he looked up and said thank you in the way he said it, like he meant it specifically, like gratitude was not a reflex but a considered response. She looked at him across the desk with the morning coming through the window behind him, and she thought about the night she'd sat in his truck at 2 in the morning with her hands still shaking and felt safe for the first time in hours and not known why. She knew why now. Some people you look right at for years and never see. And then something shifts, a crisis, a loss, a night when all the usual structures fall away. And you look again, and there they are, exactly where they've always been, just waiting for someone to actually look. She had looked. She was still looking. That was enough. That was, in fact, everything.